like to start by acknowledging that we're here today on the territory of the Lake Tenay, and thank you very much for hosting us for such a great conference. And I've known Dan and Sarah, the organizers of this event, for close to 20 years now, which is very scary to say, and they've once again done a great job, so thank you so much for what a great conference. 20 years. And you've been reminded on Pigeonhole, but we will be going to that for questions today, so don't forget to log in and put your questions and vote on the ones that you want to hear. So with that, the sort of foundation for our conversation today is a couple of reports that have come out in the last year that really talk about Canada and British Columbia's strength in energy. The first is the Generation Energy report that was done for Minister Carr federally over the last year and a half, and it had 4 key tenets for Canada's energy future. How do we get to a place that's meeting our global environmental commitments as well as harnessing our strength from an energy perspective? First being efficiency, the second being increased use of clean electricity, the third being decarbonizing our traditional energy sources, and the fourth being increasing our export opportunities globally and harnessing that great low-carbon made-in-Canada energy. The second document that's foundational for us today is Clean BC, which was announced in December. That also really showcases the opportunity we have here in British Columbia to both harness our energy strength, building on our great renewable electricity foundation, and look at the export product, again, of low-carbon energy we can send out around the world to help everybody meet their Paris commitments. So with that, each of our panelists is going to do some opening comments, and then we'll move to questions. So Mark, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Colleen. I'm going to move this down a little. Mark Edwards is a little taller, so I'm going to tease her about that for most of the day. But I do want to thank Colleen for the introduction and thank each of you for the opportunity to speak and be on the panel today. I'd also like to acknowledge that we operate in the traditional territory of and in partnership with the Blueberry River First Nation, the Halfway River First Nation, the West Moberly First Nation, Prophet River First Nation, and the Saulteaux First Nation. Many of you know us as Progress Energy. We've been here for 17 years operating in British Columbia under that name, and we're very proud at the end of last year to take on the corporate name of our parent as PETRONAS Canada. For those of you that are unfamiliar with PETRONAS, we're a large, multinational, Fortune 500 company that operates in over 30 countries around the world. We have strong values centered on sustainability, and the focus for the organization continues to be generational and decades in nature. We are one of the largest producers and marketers of LNG in the world. Currently, we're ranked 3rd globally. We continue to chase that company that's 2nd. And most importantly for British Columbia, our natural gas strategy as a corporation is centered on the worldwide growth of our natural gas resources and feeding that through LNG into the developing markets that we have in Asia and Southeast Asia. In Canada, we are one of the largest natural gas resource owners in Canada. We're the second largest resource owner in Petronas's family. And that's a material comment given the size, scale, and scope of Petronas's worldwide operations. We own over 900,000 gross acres of mineral rights and have over 60 trillion cubic feet of unconventional natural gas, improved and contingent resource. To put that size in perspective, our participation in the LNG Canada project, which for us is an exceptionally proud moment, represents less than 10% of the total proved and contingent resource that we own in northeastern British Columbia. That means we need to find more markets for our natural gas. We need to have continued access to tidewater for export. It means we need to have continuing certainty in all aspects of our business. And importantly, it also means that we need to have a clear commitment to dialogue and the creation of sustained industry, community, government, and First Nation partnerships. I have seen that commitment here over the last 2 days, and I would like to thank each and every one of you for your participation and engagement in that regard. As one of the major players in LNG, we consistently look at fundamentals in world markets, especially growth centered on Southeast Asia. These economies are experiencing significant growth in population and economic development, and they are actively looking for a reliable supply of energy. We see natural gas in British Columbia as one of the top areas to supply that demand. Our industry is well regulated. We have a long history of environmental development in the province under world-class environmental standards and expectations. We have partnerships with First Nation communities and the communities in which we operate every day. We have an abundant resource that's competitive in terms of cost of supply globally. And we have a commitment to continue to innovate and develop the clean tech that's necessary to support the sustainable expectations that each of us have, including industry, as we move forward. According to the International Energy's 2018 World Outlook, global energy demand is expected to increase by over 20% in the next 20 years. That requires investment of more than $2 trillion per year to support that energy. With British Columbia's massive natural gas resources and world-class regulatory framework, we are, in our opinion as PETRONAS, well positioned to lead the responsible development of clean-burning natural gas as a component of the world energy mix go forward. And it's important to note that LNG and the use of that natural gas displaces coal and other more emissions-intensive fuels currently used elsewhere. If we choose not to meet that growing demand, or if we're unable to, that demand remains. And as I've said, that will likely be filled by dirtier, high-emission fuels or production from areas that do not claim and do not operate under the same stringent standards that we have in British Columbia. From a global perspective and from a personal perspective, that would be exceptionally unfortunate. Continued misinformation and polarization of issues is challenging for us. It's impeding Canada and British Columbia's ability to take that leadership role in reducing global emissions. And there is no argument, from my perspective, that the world needs to reduce emissions. It's impeding market access, and it's leaving our province's massive resources stranded and discounted. And it's impeding our industry's continuous drive to innovate, to be efficient, and to reduce our footprint in the air, land, and water. The energy industry is an anchor for Canada's economy, and a healthy energy industry is critical, in my opinion, to the transition and journey to a more efficient and clean world. This transition isn't going to be free. It will require sustained and ongoing investment in technology, infrastructure, and jobs. I believe that transition is possible. Finally, and very important to me personally, is our commitment as PETRONAS Canada to take a leadership role in creating long-term partnerships in the First Nation communities we operate. PETRONAS globally has a long history of supporting development of Indigenous business, of creation of local skills and employment, and sustainable jobs in communities we operate in around the world. These partnerships must be mutually beneficial. They must be respect-based, they must be transparent, and they must be founded for the long term. Without that, we will fail. I'd like to say thank you again for the opportunity to be on this panel and share our views today with you. PETRONAS Canada intends to be here for generations. That is the business model that we have. And our parent company is committed to doing things the right way, balancing respect for the environment, partnerships with communities and First Nations, and sustainable business as we move forward. To be successful, I think we must move away from our historic insular thinking. We have to forge new meaningful relationships. We have to form new ways to have dialogue. We must work together. And as I said, and I thank everybody in this room, over the last 2.5 days, I've observed that, I've witnessed that, and that gives us hope that we can forge that alliance and that partnership forward. I would like to thank you for joining PETRONAS and the panel as we champion this incredible opportunity that I think exists for British Columbia to lead on the world stage. The dialogue is critical, and I look forward to answering your questions as we move forward. Thank you.
Right, Mr. Nikolejsin.
Good morning. And I'd like to thank the Nikolejsin and the conference organizers for inviting me here today and to speak to you about these important topics. So just in a few minutes, I'll first of all talk about my role in British Columbia and then relate that to some of the things going on and some of the topics. When it comes to energy and my job as the Deputy Minister of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources, there's 4 areas that highly relate to this topic. First of all, I have responsibility, my ministry has responsibility for BC Hydro. BC Hydro is at the very center, as everyone knows, of the electrification story in BC, what's happening with big projects like Site C. We're involved deeply in the policy environment that creates the independent power producer projects we've seen in British Columbia, involved in the review of BC Hydro that Premier referenced yesterday in his speech, which will be soon coming out, all of which highly relates to the rates that people pay for electricity, including our industrial users, and how that all matters should be self-evident, but I will talk about that. I deal a lot with, I call it the northeastern BC issues. So I work with our producers in northeastern BC a lot. We deal with lots of opportunities and issues up there with all sorts of things. We work closely with First Nations and across Treaty 8 and deeply involved in a lot of aspects. The LNG and pipeline space, I work on that as well. LNG Canada, again, which Premier talked about yesterday, we're very much involved in those kinds of decisions and helping with the analysis that was referenced yesterday, and working on pipeline issues such as is in the media and has been around Coastal GasLink for a while. And then the regulatory space. Working as chair of the Board of Oil and Gas Commission, but also my role working with the policy environment, with the BC Utilities Commission, and how the regulators influence everything that happens. So all of that is to say we have our fingerprints deeply all over a lot of what ultimately happens around the policy space in British Columbia and our attractiveness for investment. How that matters to things that are going on out there. So let's talk about Clean BC first of all. So just a show of hands from the audience. How many people have heard of Clean BC? Another show of hands. How many people have actually read the document? Yeah. So most people, and I would say even that subset is outsized compared to what you'd find out there, on the street. And what happens is people get their information from what the media chooses to report about what Clean BC is, as opposed to the substance of what's really going on there. And as it relates to this audience and these topics, the reason I make the point is that the Clean BC document is important in a couple of respects. Number one is it establishes the targets that everyone talks about, and the plan shows how we're going to get to 75% of our targets, and is pretty crunchy in that regard, and the budget that's upcoming will show even more how serious this government is about hitting those targets, and that tends to dominate the story about what Clean BC is. But Clean BC is also about growth, and clean growth, and how do we actually grow the economy? And you heard that yesterday from our Premier saying, that's important. It's really important to hit our targets, but not at the expense of the economy. So what that plan anticipates is how do we grow the economy? And how do we do that within the confines of a plan? And believe me, that's pretty different than a lot of climate plans that you see being rolled out in other areas of Canada, North America, the world. It doesn't just fixate on one dimension of the problem. It really is contemplative about how do we grow the economy. And make no mistake, grow the economy within the confines of our emissions aspirations. A good example of what that forces you to wrestle with, whether you're government from a policy perspective or whether you're industry from a project perspective, was, well, how are we going to do that? So we just heard Mark says he wants more LNG projects. Well, how do you do that within the confines and context of a plan? It forces you down technology decisions like e-drives rather than gas drives to produce the LNG. So those kinds of decisions get influenced by the policy environment, by the Clean BC targets and so on. And so industry is well aware, if you want to build this industry, we got to find a way to do it inside of our emissions targets. Excuse me. And there are opportunities in there for lots of technology, for partnerships around with First Nations, with hydro and other things. So we'll talk more about that in just one sec. The competitiveness part of that is the flip side of that coin. So again, that was pretty purposeful when the Premier talked about that in the context of LNG Canada. It does us no good as a province or as an economy to hit all our targets if it puts people out of work and causes economic hardship in this province. That is not the plan. And so it's a real challenge when you start working on this, because I just talked about the example of e-drives. Sounds good, but can we actually do those kinds of technological things and still produce LNG, as one example, and meet the world price? We exist in a world market, and Mark's right in his comments. Canada is an exemplary supplier of low emissions LNG, but we've got to be able to do it at a price that meets the world market, and that's true for all of our commodities. So as we think about things in policy instruments like the carbon tax, there's issues around how high you can raise things like a carbon tax and affect the competitiveness of any industry, and where does that push them out of the market? And if the effect of that is it pushes them into a jurisdiction that doesn't give a damn, how's that good for the climate? How's that good for the planet? How's that good for anyone? So that's the intricacies when Premier talks about things we did around emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries. That's what we're doing. And here's the most crunchy example. So, and this is what drives me crazy is when you listen to the zero-sum game people out there. And this is most often, climate deniers on one side and environmental zealots on the other side. They want to make this a zero-sum game where somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. And my best evidence that that's not true is LNG Canada. LNG Canada is paying the carbon tax. There's a strong incentive inside their operations for them to reduce emissions. There's a price signal on emissions that motivates them to make choices to get that carbon tax bill down. That's a good thing. So next time you're listening to the whatever coming out of other provinces that say you can't have a carbon tax, how could you possibly have a carbon tax and still have industry? Ask them, what about LNG Canada? Next thing is just very quickly on branding. One of the things that we're really, really turning our minds to as Canada and as the province is if we can crack the nut of how to have clean industry that is low emissions, low intensity, high performing in the world, and we're using our products to displace dirtier products elsewhere in the world, whether it's other LNG or coal, whatever it is. The fact is, Mark said it, it is indisputably true. The world demand for energy is growing, it's not shrinking. Renewables are growing quite quickly. They're still a very small percentage of the world's energy consumption needs. The IEA keeps revising its forecast upward on oil consumption. That's the real world. So what we're trying to do is displace those dirtier sources with cleaner choices that we can produce here. And if we can meet the market, there is an opportunity to brand our products. And without going into it a lot, it's not unlike the conversation around blood diamonds. Not everybody gives a damn where their diamonds come from. In fact, most people probably don't. And in fact, if you look around the world, they just want them to be as cheap as possible, and they'll turn a blind eye to how they were produced. But there are many countries that are not like that. Many consumers in those countries, many companies in those countries, and many of those partners are inside of our LNG projects, companies that do care and are trying to walk the talk. And so is there an opportunity to brand our natural resources in a way that supplies the world economy for copper, gas, liquid propane, met coal, whatever it might be? My last point, and then I'll stop, is connecting all of that to, again, another thing the Premier mentioned is this idea that global warming is not a BC phenomenon or Canada one, it's a global one. And one of the things, in order for what I just mentioned a moment ago to really start to matter, is the ability to trade credits back and forth on emissions. That is an excruciatingly hard thing to figure out. there's lots of work going on internationally in that space, but it is hopeful to imagine that for those countries that do care, you can imagine a future where they will be able to reduce emissions in their economy, and we will be able to take credit for that reduction inside of our accounting of our emissions. And if and when and were that future to evolve to a positive place, I think that's the last piece of the puzzle it will take to be able to unlock the remaining arguments about why not to develop more of our natural resources here. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So, Karen.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Claytley-Tenay people for allowing us to conduct our business on your territory and welcoming us here. And I'd like to also thank the conference organizers as well for allowing me to come here to speak and to be on this panel. I'm honored. I'd also like to sort of give you a bit of a background on who I am and what I do. I am Wet'suwet'en. I'm G'dimden from the House of Spokes. I'm a Skaizit. My mother is a hereditary chief, and her name is Nakwaon. And what her name means is a woman with a long arm that gathers the people. Our ancestors originate from Hagwilget, and we've migrated to Burns Lake. We have a long line of leadership within our family and community. And I've done social work for the last 25 years in the front lines in various capacities and seen firsthand the social issues that our people face. I've had the opportunity to be the chief of my nation from 2010 to 2016. When you step into elected leadership, you have a couple of choices. Either you maintain the status quo or you find a way forward for your people. And that is coming out of poverty, addressing those social and economic issues that every First Nations community faces. During that time, as chief for those 6 years, I've stood in the light of controversy and been misunderstood as an elected chief of my community. You know, having the mandate to oversee all of the issues within our community, like I said, you try to find a way forward and not maintain status quo. And I think that what I've seen is that First Nations have been shortchanged for too long when it comes to extracting resources within our communities and territories, whether it be forestry and mining and now LNG. You know, as the chief counselor for my community, we've had to do our due diligence, meet with our community members on a monthly basis, on top of all of our other overwhelming tasks that we do as leaders, and ensuring that our people were informed about why we're signing on to LNG. Is it safe? You know, as part of our role as First Nations people, our role is to be stewards of the land. And so how do you balance that with the social and economic issues that we face? When we signed our agreement with the province, we received a huge backlash to this. And part of it was because people are misinformed. They don't have all the information. And I say this in most of my presentations in my undergrad as social work. I had one of our professors sort of challenge me if I strongly believe in something and I hold it close to my heart, he says, let that go and argue the other side. And what that helped me do was to sort of, it's okay to let go of your strongly held beliefs and just look at the other side, look at the other point of view. And that helped me to be more open-minded. It helped me to be teachable. And it helped me to learn on how we can move our nation forward, at the same time protecting our environment and balancing the social and economic issues of our community. And I strongly believe in education and awareness, and that is why the First Nations LNG Alliance was formed. Because too many of our leaders are being misunderstood for the work that they do, especially in light of all of this controversy that most of you have been seeing in the media. I have nothing but respect for our Wet'suwet'en and Unist'ot'en people. And my fight is not with them. My fight as a social worker and a former politician, it is about our people. They're forgetting that important, critical piece. It's about our people, finding a way forward. And it does feel like at this time we're in the eye of the storm. I'm going upstream at a very heavy current, along with the leaders. And it's a tough time to say anything politically about this whole issue. But I'm hoping that at some point, the internal issues of the Wet'suwet'en will be addressed and that we can sit down as people to overcome our differences and work together as one people to move our nations forward. Taking into context the whole issue of the federal and provincial mandates for the environment and clean energy, I think that, it's taken me quite a while to learn about LNG. It's taken me, it's led me, this path has led me to doing the work that I'm doing. I look at the bigger picture. I've had to educate myself. I've read that book by the late Jim Prentice. I promote that book. It's called Triple Crown. I've taken the time to begin to understand and educate myself on resource development in Canada and what it means to BC. We have 600 First Nations across Canada. We have 200 in BC. I get that picture where we're trying to move our resources to Asia, but we need the support of the First Nations people. We need them to be the critical players in all of this, especially the coastal First Nations. So I get that big picture. I get that it's going to help our whole economy across Canada. And, we're hearing from time and time again that First Nations want equity ownership. And I think that's the way to go. Because what we administer at the community level is not enough. You've heard, and people call it rhetoric, we're tired of managing poverty. We're tired of just getting a few meager dollars. We want to be a critical player in all of this. And that's an important message for all of BC and all of Canada. What I'm hoping is that when the dust settles, that we're able to sit down as a people and discuss our issues and come to a resolve for the people. An interesting shift in the public dialogue seems to be occurring after the initial nationwide outrage and protests. More public support for the band councils, more public questioning of their hereditary claims, more understanding of the complex governance issues, more nuances. So if anything, I always try to look at things and create value in it What good has come out of this? The Wet'suwet'en people are on the map. The Unistoten people are on the map. The elected councils, people are educating themselves about what elected councils are. The whole national conversation seems to be shifting, increasing balancing of economic versus environmental factors. Although governments are struggling to balance regulatory responsibilities, the honor of the crown, and perceptions of political correctness. And although academics and First Nations political organizations are focused on historical injustices and grievance seeking, industry, individual communities, and new organizations like the First Nations LNG Alliance, the Indian Resource Council, the Eagle Spirit Energy Group are making real, on-the-ground progress in the complex social and economic issues. To conclude, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities are highly polarized, but the narrative is slowly becoming more informed and mature. So I'm hoping that in this bigger landscape of energy resource development, that First Nations across the land are going to be part of that equation, and that we do start seeing real benefits from these resource extraction projects. And we must be part of the players at the table. Misai.
Thanks for that, Karen. I'm going to try and tie a little bit of everything together here. I just want to first welcome everyone and thank you very much for having me. I also want to acknowledge that we are in the Lheidli territory. And further, thank the city of Prince George. I managed to get out last night a little bit and enjoy some of the food and beverage, and it's just great to see the city moving forward and thriving. And also Sarah and Dan and everyone at C3 Alliance, they've really pulled a real nice conference here together. It's my first time speaking here, and to see everyone come together, I mean, pulling in forestry, mining, tech, oil and gas, all into one room. The cross-pollination that's going on, hearing what's happening in the mining industry and how there's revenue sharing going on there with the province and the mining side and in forestry. We're all facing the same issues, and I can see us now starting to work together to kind of resolve them and move them forward. As was mentioned, I'm Dan Woznow. I'm Senior Vice President, Energy Exports and General Manager at AltaGas. Born and raised in British Columbia and been working in project development for about 25 years now. So in the mining sector, renewable energy sector, and in the last 6 years or so, focused on the energy export piece. And while we've been having challenges and I've seen the growth and changes going on here, we're starting to see some successes, and I think we're starting to find our stride, right? The First Nations LNG Alliance and others, getting these communities together, getting people talking, looking for common goals and solutions. I think that's a key. So it's really good to see that, and I think we are finding our stride and starting to see some success. With AltaGas, for those of you that don't know about us, we're a pretty large integrated infrastructure company. We have three aspects of our business, three real legs. Power generation, that's renewable, non-renewable. We have natural gas utilities, so supply natural gas to homes and businesses. And we also have a midstream business where we actually don't drill for natural gas, but we'll gather it when people and producers are pulling it out of the ground. We'll collect it, we'll clean it up, take out the natural gas liquids like propane and butane, and get that out to market and get the natural gas in our homes for heating and cooking. On the utility side, we just recently had a big transaction where we bought a large utility in the US. We are all across North America, and with this latest acquisition, we actually supply natural gas to the White House. So several occasions we wanted to turn the gas off and cool things down there, but it hasn't worked and the rhetoric continues. So we'll see if they're going to pay their bills though with the shutdown. That's my concern. We have a big footprint, and for me it's in British Columbia, and we have about $2 billion in assets here. We're currently expanding some of our gas facilities up in the northeast at Townsend and North Pine, but my focus over the last 5 years has been in the natural gas and propane side of the business. And we're currently constructing Canada's first propane export facility in Prince Rupert. It's relatively small, it's about a $500 million project, and it'll move about 1.2 million tons of propane between Canada and Japan and other parts of Asia. The big thing about this, though, is it's opening up new markets for Canadian producers. We've heard that on the forestry side and mining side, it's key. You know, up until 2012, in 2012, the US was importing. They were a net importer of propane, okay? After 2012, with the shale gas revolution going on in the Northeast and Utica and Marcellus deposits and down in Texas, they've actually become a net exporter. And now they're one of the world's largest exporter of propane. So our market's dried up. They move around 1.1 million barrels a day of propane now out of the Gulf Coast and primarily into Asia. In perspective, our project's about 40,000 barrels a day, so relatively small. But it's new and it's opening up markets for us, which is absolutely key because we never had those before. And we look at it, and like Dave was mentioning, the offsets that they're trying to get at a high level around the globe. I mean, you know, Japan uses propane for heating and cooking, about half the population. Here we see it as propane for barbecues and camping. They use it for heating and cooking. In Indonesia, right, 4,000 inhabited islands, they were using kerosene for much of their energy, primarily for cooking, not heating. And the kerosene spills and so forth, they've transitioned over the last 4 or 5 years into propane. That's a big and growing market. India, the same. India and Prime Minister Modi in India was looking and pushing to get propane in the hands of people because they've been still cooking with charcoal and cow dung, dried cow dung. And so the air quality changes that are going on, and if we can get those greenhouse gas emissions down and participate in that, that's great for our businesses here. And it gives us an opportunity to, you know, sell our product, our Canadian-based, you know, low emission, low intensity greenhouse gas products overseas. You know, Asia wants our energy. They want to diversify their supply like we want to diversify our markets. They want a safe and secure supply. I mean, with all the rhetoric going on with Trump, with the changes in trade that happen on the global high seas is amazing. A few little tweets and comments way back when, before any tariffs were implemented, and the seaborne trade of propane changed, right? People stopped trying to get product out of the US, started to move into moving product out of Japan and from the Mideast because they didn't want to get caught in the trade war that they could see developing. Japan, for example, 88% of their energy has to come from overseas. I mean, they cannot have disruption in their energy source or their economy gets impacted seriously. They still have 30% coal in their energy stack, right, for the foreseeable future. And so we see that these opportunities for us to help and move our products into these markets is key. You know, from Canada to Japan, it's a 10-day trip for a vessel, okay, or from basically Prince Rupert to Japan. That same product moving out of the Gulf Coast is 25 days one direction, and you've got to go and look at the jamming that's going on at the Panama Canal. Even though it's recently been expanded, you know, Trump's going around the world saying, you got to buy my energy, I need you to buy more, right? Get rid of all these discrepancies. And that's starting to cause congestion at the Panama. And so from Canada, a straight shot, our friends in Japan, we've got one of the largest propane traders in Japan that's buying half of our product out of our facility. They're owned by Mitsubishi and Idemitsu Kosan, and they just love the fact that they can call and get a product in 10 days. In Japan, they actually use propane as well for strategic reasons. After Fukushima, propane was the only energy source they could get out to the communities to kind of keep them alive and moving forward. And so having a strategic resource now accessible out of Canada, a 10-day stretch, is really important to them. You know, it's funny, 5 years ago when I was going to Japan, talking with our trade ministries over there, and the ambassador said, all that we hear is Canada can't get anything done, right? And it was very frustrating for them and frustrating for us. And now we're seeing, you know, our friends at Fortis down here, they're starting to move LNG and ISO containers over to Asia. We just had a great announcement of LNG Canada. And with our small propane facility starting to move vessels, we hope, within the next few months, in early Q2, we hope to have the first cargo going to Japan. we're starting to demonstrate we can get things done. And I think the dialogue over in Asia and abroad is starting to change in our direction. So I think, as people have said, right, it's education, it's continued dialogue and working towards common goals, common interests. And if we see that, and we're starting to see that come together, I think the opportunities are there for the LNG, propane, and other products and commodities, more value add, moving over to these markets. So I'm optimistic, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you to all of our panel for those opening remarks. And it's clear we are definitely a powerhouse here in this province when it comes to energy. So the first question I'm going to turn to you all with is, how can BC leverage its strength in all aspects of the energy sector, whether it's our great emission-free electricity grid that has so much room to expand, whether it's our LNG export opportunity, propane export opportunity, the ability to export our electricity as well, whether it's to our neighbors to the east or to the south, and how can we all work together within that energy space to really achieve the best for British Columbia and Canada? Mark?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think that's the most relevant question of the day. BC has some fantastic strengths, and I think you talked about them. Quality of the resource, the quality of the workforce, the people that live and reside and work here have created what we believe to be a world-class environment. You know, the regulatory environment, the policies that are developed, the emergence of Clean BC plan is an excellent step. And so for me, it's finding ways to build on that brand, as Dave talked about, and how does that move forward. I think the most important step is dialogue. It's the conversation. And when I talk about dialogue and conversation, it has to be informed. And I think Karen said it very well when she was up there. She talked about when she entered the role, she became informed. She read and she understood and she started to learn about the industry. And I think when we have that dialogue, especially in the First Nation communities in which we operate, we have to go into that informed. And we have to spend the time, from my perspective as industry, understanding history and understanding culture and understanding what's important. Otherwise, in my opinion, the dialogue becomes less valuable. I was going to say irrelevant, but I don't think that's the right phrase, but it becomes less valuable. And so, to me, a lot of the pieces are there. It's bringing it together, governments, industry, communities, First Nations, and have an informed conversation and take the time, each of us, to understand before we have that dialogue.
So I spoke a fair bit about that in my comments. When I look at the question, I like to think of it as a three-legged stool, and we need all three legs in order for the stool to stand up. We need willing investors. At the end of the day, it's the private sector needs to have confidence and make a business case to bring substantive investment. You need First Nations. I mean, it is if it's not clear to people yet, I don't know, it is as clear as it can get. We need First Nation partnerships and involvement and genuine benefit sharing in order to make things go ahead. And it needs to be green and clean. It needs to fit in the Clean BC plan. And that's electrification, that's all the things I talked about. You need all three legs of the stool, and then projects will stand up.
Karen?
I think that just to touch on what both of my fellow candidates up here have said, it is about, closing the gap for Indigenous people, increasing the quality of life for Indigenous people, and looking at the different aspects of it, the employment contracts, the training contracts, the different business and joint venture opportunities for First Nations. I think those are the critical pieces on the ground. And I think, it's going to be continued to be stated that Indigenous people need to be part of this conversation. Because, on the three-legged piece that he's talking about, that is our role as Indigenous people, is to be the stewards of the land. But at the same time, too, we have to look at ways and means of the social and economic issues of our people. So I think that's critical. And I think on a broader perspective, I think that, you know, we need to be part of the nationwide and province-wide strategic plans and look at the whole social and economic climate.
Dan, I'm going to tweak it slightly for you because you have the misfortune of me knowing a lot of your background. So you've worked on both natural gas and propane projects in BC, but you've also worked on hydro and wind projects as well. And so what are the synergies you see from how the renewable industry is operated in this province in strong partnership with Indigenous communities that can be translated into our broader energy sector?
Well, I mean, we've heard everyone talk about the need for electrification. I mean, that's absolutely key if we're going to be meeting the greenhouse gas objectives of the province, and that's also going to give us that maple leaf, hopefully, flag on the molecules when they go to Asia. But I think, you know, there's not oil and gas in every First Nations community. There's not pipelines going through. You know, looking at it from a broader perspective, if we're able to look at, you know, solar, wind, and other forms of energy that some of these other communities will have in them, they can participate in getting those, you know, the greenhouse gases down and contributing to the need for electrification across the province. And so we can achieve a bunch of objectives, have people more involved and engaged, have some local folks working and contributing, but in other aspects of the business, not necessarily directly in the oil and gas side.
Great. So I'm going to flip quickly here to one of our pigeonhole questions. And so talking about, is there an opportunity to share pipeline rights away rather than everyone developing their own? And we certainly saw this in the renewable industry as well when it came to transmission lines. And there has to be some efficiencies and strategic thinking around some of these utility corridors. So I wonder if you can comment on how industry and government and communities can collaborate to minimize the footprint of some of this very necessary infrastructure. Dave, do you want to start? Because you kind of sit at the center of all this.
Sure. I think, first of all, I'll say single-use pipelines are, other than ones that are very small and local to you know, a pad site or something, but I assume the question is about big transmission pipelines like Coastal GasLink. Those are the exception rather than the rule. I mean, the systems we have are almost all shared, but how those get built is by multiple users having a common need. And so when it comes to getting gas all the way across, you know, from northeastern BC to the coast, you know, what has made the model work for LNG Canada is they had a big enough project they could sustain and pay for single pipe. There is lots of other projects that I know about that would love to find a footing in Prince Rupert and Kitimat along the coast, none of which are the size or scale that can afford their own pipeline. So no feedstock, no project. On the other hand, there's a couple of pipeline projects that are already have their environmental assessment certificate that are just sitting there, you know, waiting to be built perhaps. No one's going to take the risk of building a multi-billion-dollar, $5-6 billion pipeline with no customers. So catch-22. So that's a conundrum. But to go to the specific question, of course we would rather have one pipe that's shared by multiple people, and I think industry is really learning that lesson hard, that it's much, much better to share those risks. But it is a catch-22 that we're currently living within.
So Dan, in your with your hydro development, you guys were part of the Northwest Transmission Line. I wonder if you could speak to that example as maybe a path forward, something that could be replicated on other linear infrastructure.
I mean, for the most part, you know, having if the government wants to take a risk and go and build a line for us, that would be wonderful. You know, there's a whole, it's a challenge, of course, right? And when you're bringing multiple users together, you know, on a single project like that, what happens if one falls off and everything else, right? So there's issues around that, but I think this is what has to happen, common corridors and trying to get people committed to working together with it, and I hope that there is. I mean, you know, in lots of jurisdictions across other parts of the globe, the governments do step up, and they're the ones putting in some of this trunk line infrastructure, right? Because they know that it's going to be, you know, a useful tool for the development of the economy in the area. So I think it's something we have to go and try and approach and see what we can do there to work together with government and see what opportunities exist.
Well, I know our federal government is happily handing out money for things like this all across the country, so maybe we all need to help and work together in asking for some of that to come here to British Columbia.
So I have just a comment on that point. The place where we are getting a lot of attention from the federal government, and they're very interested, is on electrification. So back to Clean BC and the goals that are within there, and that one leg of the stool that has to be true, which is, you know, we actually are walking the talk when we talk about we want to be the best in class when it comes to producing these commodities. That drives electrification. The federal government is interested in being very helpful in breaking the back of a very similar problem, a similar catch-22, which is how do you get the electrical transmission into the area where companies like PETRONAS can actually consume it, because it has to be in the neighborhood. And that is something where I think governments are more likely to be helpful with, because it directly aligns with those clean BC and Canadian aspirations.
And
Yeah, please.
if I may, I build a little bit on Dave and Dan's point. I agree. The electrification and the movement towards lower emissions on the upstream side, for us is very, very important. We are very active in leading and working and trying to move power infrastructure into Northeast British Columbia, and that is certainly for the benefit of our operations because it reduces emissions, helps meet the expectations in terms of development go forward, but it also benefits communities in that area. And I think the only way projects of that magnitude, scope, and scale succeed is partnerships amongst industry, which is challenging because we're all competitive in industry, and so to actually get together and work together in some regards is tough, but I think we're seeing progress. Partnership with provincial governments, partnership with federal governments, and the opportunity to create those partnerships as well with the First Nation communities that will be both impacted and will benefit from that. And that's an interesting recognition that there are impacts and there's benefits, and we have to balance those in all areas as we move forward. So it's an important consideration, I believe, as we look overseas, as we look globally, as we look to deliver BC resource. It has to be done different. It has to be done different.
We all need to engage in some constructive co-opetition.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Karen, I'm going to flip to a different question and start with you on it. We see a lot of different dialogue happening in different parts of the province around should resource development happen, yes or no, what kind of resource development should happen, how do we do it, and just thinking back to the comment you made about being informed and how do we start to have a conversation where we can move beyond our own tightly held beliefs. And can you comment on, from your learnings and experience, how we can start to have a more constructive conversation within our province and within our country on how do we get to an energy future for Canada that truly benefits everybody?
I think one big piece is it's a glaring one, is that looking at the historical context with Indigenous people, people are seeing that whole issue of reconciliation needs to be more meaningful. Looking at maybe economic reconciliation, I think to me, that's where the rubber hits the ground. Because if people are saying, well, it's all just rhetoric, well, then we need to put those pieces into action and sort of reconcile our history and to start to deal with the issues that we're facing today. And those are, closing that gap in terms of, the quality of life for our people on the ground. And, there's, quite a few factors that we're looking at: the poverty issues, the education issues, the incarceration rates of our people, the missing, murdered Indigenous women issues. Those are all in the forefront. If Canada is such a good country, we need to start looking at the reconciliation pieces for Indigenous people. That's the glaring question that's in front of all of us. And Canada needs to reconcile and address those issues head on. And, we're at a time where we can't sit and be politically correct. Those issues are glaring at us now, and they need to be addressed.
So is there, I guess this is for the rest of the panel and yourself too, if you want to weigh in, and what role can the energy sector play in this? And I'm going to weave a couple of the questions together here on how, there's revenue that comes out of these projects. How does that revenue stay in communities? How do we ensure that folks understand that economic benefit and see how being tangible for them. And I think in some cases, it's easier closer to where the project is itself. Many of us live and work in downtown Vancouver, which predominantly is a resource community. Most people, whether they're directly working for a mining company or an energy company, or if it's the lawyer who supports that, or if it's the accountant who supports that, we're all tied to this resource economy we have in the province, but a lot of people don't realize that they are. And so how do we have that more constructive discussion and connect everybody better to this and the outcomes and the solution and the better life that's going to come from it?
Yeah, I look at LNG Canada. Let's maybe use that as an example. So there's significant celebration and opposition, but I'll focus on the celebration over the last period of time. In that decision, the decision to build a significant export terminal over the next 4 to 5 years for LNG and the jobs it creates and the opportunities it creates and otherwise. If I assume 40 years, let's just pick 40 years for the life of that. Every day for 40 years, we have to deliver 2 billion cubic feet of natural gas to the inlet of that facility for export. And as we move through the value chain and move upstream, that development has to occur on the resource side. That creates long-term opportunities for jobs, for skill, for communities, for partnerships. And so as much as I do appreciate the question around, well, how do we, when we generate revenue from LNG, bring that back in, the much larger opportunity, in my opinion, comes from that long-term, sustainable, steady ability to create growth, employment, innovate, and drive really those partnerships. And as Karen has talked about, those are what I think we need to focus on because they are long-lasting and they create that ability to grow those communities on the upstream. And so my only feedback in that regard is there's a lot of energy on the downstream and the plant, and I think that's absolutely important. There's a much broader opportunity for this province and for the partnerships and for the communities over decades as we develop into that infrastructure.
Dan?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what goes back to the communities, there's all sorts of things. It's a lot of education to let people understand how these things work and where the opportunities are. We've been lucky. I mean, we're developing this first propane export facility in Prince Rupert, and one of the things was getting operators. And we developed a training program in conjunction with the Lac-Lamson and Metlakatla groups to look at training junior operators to come into the facility. And we linked this back to folks, because there's no programs like that out here in BC. We actually linked it back to SAIT, got curriculum from Southern Alberta, brought that in with the Coast Mountain College and combined it all together to do a 6-month program that trained people up so that they're ready as operators. We had a lot of interest. We were really surprised. When we actually went out to the community, we had about 100 people apply for this. We ended up getting it down to 14 who went through the program. We have 11 graduates. As of the end of December, they're going to be hired and working at our facility. So I think there's a lot of things that go in, and all that's local. That's locals getting the benefits of the project, and that's what has to happen. It's that training and education piece.
So one of the themes that hasn't come up today, and I'm actually a little bit shocked because it's been so dominant through any energy conversation over the last 5 years, is energy literacy and the fact that most of us are so disconnected from when our energy comes. And so...
Got 30 votes. Got 30 votes.
Word energy literacy. Yes. Anyhow, thanks, Dave.
Sorry.
I'm really on my A game today. At least I got your name right. My question for you, Dave, though, is as with Clean BC and this need to understand energy and the interplay between it, what work do you see from government's perspective doing to help educate the province and its citizens broadly, and what role can industry play in helping to advance that conversation so that we better understand where our energy is coming from and what that connectivity is, and that we have good products here in this province and something we should be proud of?
Want me to start? Yeah, I think, and that's why I like that question, because I think that is a huge issue of people, don't know where the meat comes from in the grocery store, and they sure as heck don't know where their energy comes from, and they should care about both those things, and it's what I keep saying is, and there's other questions about pollution and this stuff, BC has nothing to be ashamed of. We have the toughest regulatory space in the world, and the fact is, the world needs this energy. It's going to come from somewhere, and we are the best. I can tell you that not everybody leans on our producer community with as much red tape and regulatory muscle as we do, and it's because we actually care about those things like water and so it adds to the cost of doing business. It makes it harder, but at the end result, it actually is an industry we can and should be proud of, and that's what we need to be communicating about all the time. And I can tell you the best energy literacy lesson that's happened in a long time was when the main pipeline that brings all the gas down to the Lower Mainland ruptured a few months back. There was an existential crisis brewing where people suddenly worried about the fact whether the lights were going to be on or not, and suddenly this notion of taking interruptible gas contracts had a real crunchy meaning about who was going to get switched off and when, and I tell you, we were one cold snap away from draining our reserves and having to turn gas off in some pretty important places. And I tell you, that focused the minds of the local elected officials and emergency management planners and all sorts in a way that hasn't happened in a good long time. So, wouldn't suggest that as a way to build energy literacy, but it makes the point that people just completely take it for granted.
Yeah, it was like we don't appreciate our great reliable electricity until there's a unfortunate storm right before Christmas.
I think we touched on that a bit earlier. I mean, I think that we want to try and brand, and I think education here in Canada, but also education abroad, and I think it's something industry has to work with the province and Canada on. I think we have to look at this as a Canadian solution to the globe, not just BC, because that's how we're looked upon around the world. And it's like anything, right? If we can get a product, I don't think we're going to get a lot of extra money for having LNG arrive from Canada versus from Qatar or some other place. I think there's going to be competitive. But if you've got that green maple leaf label on a can versus one that's a no-name brand and you're not sure what's behind it, I think that's going to be the differentiator that will get our product picked up. And I think that's something that we have to try and push, like it's great in BC, but more globally, so that when we are going overseas, that people prefer to buy that Canadian product.
Okay, so we're at last question time. I know folks have flights to make and lunch to get to. So last question asks for brief answers. We're back 5 years from now. Sarah's been so kind to invite us to come back because we haven't totally been a disaster today. What is the success for BC that you're talking about here 5 years from now? Start with Dan and we'll work our way.
Well, hopefully LNG Canada is moving its product, and Fortis is moving their product, and we're increasing our propane exports, and we've got other commodities now that the globe's looking at to get from Canada, and ethane, butane, and other products and value-add products, polypropylene and others that we can be taking out of Canada and over to the coast. So I see optimistically growth happening in those areas, and we are starting to work together. We're starting to understand what it takes to work with First Nations and to get everyone involved in the conversation and do those common interests and common goals. And so I think we're going to see that growth.
Karen, 5 years from now, what's our success?
Well, what I envision is that Indigenous people have increased their quality of life. We look at the different issues that we're trying to close the gap with. Once those pieces start to increase, then we can say that we're really doing our jobs correctly across the board, whether it be provincially, federally, and internationally. I think those will be the telltale signs if Canada is keeping to their commitments, and same with the province. I think we can no longer be ignored. We need to be at the forefront, and so it is about that whole quality of life piece, and I think being a part of the discussion.
Dave?
For me, it's we've built a three-legged stool and it's standing up. We got foreign direct investment flowing into this country because people are confident and it's predictable and you can invest here, you can make a return. We've got full partnerships with First Nations, free, prior, and informed consent for our projects. They're fully sharing the benefits, and they're partners with us and with those investors. And third, it all fits inside the Clean BC plan, and it's clean and green, and it fits our brand.
Great. Mark?
That was very well said. I think the world is looking for leadership right now, and leadership in terms of supply of energy, how you do that, the partnerships, the model for doing that as we move forward. I'm expecting in 5 years from now, the world will look and say, British Columbia has evolved, developed that model, and that sets the standard for energy supply in the world.
Awesome. And just to put my small plug in for electricity, we have as electrified an upstream and energy system provincial as we can, and we're exporting that great product too.
Well said.
So with that, over to our wonderful MC and conference organizers.